The air in that dealership tasted like burnt coffee and floor wax, a combination designed to mask the smell of desperation, and I sat across from Gary, a salesman whose smile was as polished as the linoleum but carried none of its substance, calling me sweetheart while sliding a glossy brochure toward me, his gold watch catching the harsh fluorescent light every time he gestured. And I was 23, working 2 jobs, drowning in a commute that required a reliability I could not yet afford, and he promised a solution that felt like a gift. But beneath that practiced warmth lay the cold, jagged reality of a 14% interest rate buried in page 12 of a dense carbon copy contract, and he assured me the monthly payment was manageable, a word that conveniently ignored the 72-month term stretching out like a life sentence. And when he finally handed me the fob, it felt unnaturally heavy in my palm, a lead weight disguised as freedom, because that key did not truly belong to me. It was a tether to a debt that would outlast the car's original tires, and I drove off that lot with a forced smile, but my mind was already beginning to calculate the true cost of my silence, and that was the last time I ever let hollow kindness win. Because years later, Mark's voice was always loudest when he was wrong, pacing the kitchen, his heavy footsteps syncopating with the rhythmic clinical ticking of his Patek Philippe, a watch I had helped him select, now used as a metronome for my supposed inadequacy, and he leaned over the granite island telling me that I simply didn't have the stomach for the upcoming property negotiation, that I was too emotional for the math, that I would crumble the moment they mentioned the amortization schedule or the complex escrow hold, and I stayed quiet, but it wasn't the silence of submission anymore. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the static to clear, because while he saw a woman drowning in financial jargon, I was actually drowning out his noise to focus on the cold numbers, and that night the internal chaos of my fear finally transmuted into a surgical stillness. So I waited until he went to bed, then sat at the mahogany desk in the basement office, my pulse steadying for the first time in years, and I began studying the ledger with the precision of a jeweler, spending hours reading about fiduciary duties and tax liens and the specific mechanics of offshore holdings, and my fingers eventually brushed against a matte black folder hidden deep behind the archived tax returns, and inside lay a single notarized document from his father's old law firm, a piece of paper that didn't just change the math, but rewrote the entire history of our shared assets. And Mark thought he was the master architect of our future, but as I traced the faded blue ink on that page, I realized he was merely a temporary tenant in a house I already owned, because the smell of stale coffee and ink always takes me back to that windowless office where I first learned how expensive being affordable could be, and I still keep the artifact of that mistake in my desk drawer, a crumpled coffee-stained amortization schedule, paper thin and yellowed at the edges, and looking at it now feels like reading a map of a ghost town, because each line item represents a month where I thought I was building something yet I was actually sinking, and while the car's value plummeted, the interest kept me pinned under a $5,000 underwater balance, paying for a vehicle worth less than the debt I carried, a specific suffocating friction that eroded my credit score and my confidence simultaneously. And it took 36 months of disciplined quiet scraping to claw my way out of that hole, and every time I looked at that stained paper, I reminded myself I wasn't just paying for a car, but paying for a lesson in silence and strategy, until the day the final payment cleared, and the air in my lungs felt different, colder and more purposeful, and I folded that paper one last time, no longer a victim of the math, but a master of it. So when the time came again, the silence of the house was my dedicated staging ground, and I didn't reach for wine or a phone to vent. Instead, I reached for my laptop to build a financial fortress, spending 3 hours at the kitchen table scanning the fine print of local credit union offerings until I found the right leverage, and the printer started its work with a rhythmic, precise mechanical hum that felt like the steady heartbeat of a new life. Whir-click, spitting out a pre-approval letter for $45,000 at a fixed rate that would make a seasoned broker nod in respect. Because this wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a physical shield, and there is a profound quiet power in having a pre-approval letter tucked into the inner pocket of a tailored blazer, because it changes your posture, transforming you from a lead to be managed into a buyer to be feared. And I checked my credit score one last time at 812, and felt the cool satisfaction of a plan coming together, knowing I wasn't just buying a vehicle, but purchasing my sovereignty from a system that expected me to be soft and uninformed. And with financing secured, I spent further nights building a fortress of data, while my computer screen stayed lit long after the neighborhood went dark, the blue glow reflecting off my glasses as I transitioned fully from victim to architect. And I started with the wholesale reality, because while dealers talked about market adjustments and inventory shortages, I was looking at actual auction prices, creating a color-coded spreadsheet that tracked VIN histories across 3 states and highlighting every time a similar model crossed the block, knowing the exact moment the hammer fell and what the winning bid was, and it wasn't 48,000, it was 39, and I spent spent hours digging into the hidden numbers, the ones they assume customers never hear about, mapping the dealer holdback, that secret 2 to 3% of MSRP the manufacturer pays the dealer after the sale, and I found the regional advertising fees and the floor plan interest. So by the time I was finished, I didn't just know what they paid for the car. I knew what it cost them to let it sit on the lot for 34 days. And then came the trade-in, because they had offered a generous valuation of $12,000 citing minor cosmetic wear. But I didn't argue. Instead, I drove to 3 different private appraisers across the county, paying for independent inspections that came back clean, logging the mileage and condition notes with surgical precision, and those certificates sat in a folder on my desk, valuing my vehicle at $16,500 based on historical wholesale data, not local greed. And to ensure I never lost leverage, I calculated my entry point using the strict 20% down payment rule, because this wasn't about monthly payments. It was about immediate equity, needing to ensure that the moment I drove off that lot, I owned more of that car than the bank did, insulating myself from the instant depreciation that swallows most buyers whole. And I watched the cells in my spreadsheet turn green as I adjusted the numbers, feeling the shift from uncertainty to absolute control, because their world was built on emotional manipulation and high-pressure tactics, but my world was built on cold, hard arithmetic, and I tracked the lot's aging inventory, knowing which units were approaching their 90-day mark, where interest payments eat profit, and I highlighted the VIN of a charcoal gray SUV that had been ignored by 3 previous weekend crowds, its price tag bloated with a $5,000 markup that had no basis in reality. And by the time I reached the heavy glass doors of the premium dealership, the frantic noise of the morning had been replaced by a calculated internal chill, and the salesman appeared before I had even reached the center of the floor, wearing a suit that cost more than his monthly commission and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, busy scanning me for a wedding ring or a husband following behind, seeing a woman alone and reading it as vulnerability. But he was looking at the old version of me, and when he launched immediately into his script designed to bypass logic and trigger an emotional impulse, speaking of incredible promotional rates expiring at 5 o'clock sharp, I met his gaze with a silence that seemed to strip the gloss right off his shoes, and I waited exactly 3 seconds after he finished speaking before I answered, telling him I was there to discuss the out-the-door price, and we could skip the features because I had already read the technical specifications and the independent safety ratings. And when he tried the classic pivot, attempting to bury the actual cost under the fog of interest rates and extended terms, I remained standing on that cool marble, unmoving, telling him we were not discussing financing, not discussing monthly payments or trade-in values or credit applications, that we would lock the sale price of the asset first, and once that number was notarized on a buyer's order, I would decide how the transaction was settled. And the shift in the room was palpable as his posture straightened, the condescension replaced by a flickering of genuine wary respect. And then the glass door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the dealership's synthetic cheer and replacing it with the sterile, pressurized air of the finance and insurance office, where Miller, the finance manager, sat behind a desk that felt 3 sizes too large for the room, sliding the infamous 4-square worksheet toward me with the practiced grace of a card shark. Speaking of gap insurance and ceramic coatings and extended warranties that were basically free when rolled into a monthly payment, a cacophony of manufactured fear, but I opened my leather-bound notepad and placed it on the desk where I had already written the dealer's invoice price, the holdback percentage, and the exact destination fee, and every time he paused for confirmation, I simply met his gaze and said no without an ounce of heat in the word, because a no with a reason is a negotiation, but a no without one is a wall, and I watched the slight tremor in his hand as he realized the trick was failing, and when he mentioned that for just $5 more a month I could have tire and wheel protection, I simply tapped the top right figure on my notepad and told him the ceramic coating was a non-starter, that the doc fee was capped by state law at $150, not the $600 he had printed, and he had to leave the room twice to check with his director, a classic delay tactic meant to wear me down, but I used the time to check the timestamps on my phone, noting exactly how long he was making me wait, until he returned with the bravado evaporated, replaced by sullen transactional efficiency, and then I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the black folder I had been carrying since Tuesday morning, laying it flat on the desk, and inside sat a single page from my local credit union time-stamped just 2 hours ago with the number 2.9% circled in thick red ink, and I told Sarah simply that her best offer was 5% too heavy for my signature, and I produced the final document from the sleeve, the drafting instruction, a total bypass utilizing a direct-to-vendor payment structure that effectively removed the dealership's ability to mark up the interest or add those predatory origination fees, a surgical strike against the hidden margins they relied on to survive, and I watched her manicured hand tremble slightly as she realized this was not a negotiation she could ever win with charm or pressure, and I reached for my own fountain pen, a heavy brushed silver piece that felt substantial in my grip, signing the single instruction that dictated exactly how my money would move, the ink wet and dark, a permanent mark of my refusal to play a rigged game, and the soft click of the cap signaled the end of her influence. And then the garage door hummed shut, a final punctuation mark on the life I had dismantled with surgical precision, and I slid into the driver's seat of the SUV, the leather cool and smelling of nothing but sheer potential, remembering a different version of this exit years ago when the engine rattled like a box of loose bolts and my pulse raced even faster, when every mile was a gamble against a flickering gaslight and a desperate prayer that the grocery check wouldn't bounce before Monday morning. But today the ignition responded with a low, expensive purr that felt like an ally rather than a liability, and I pulled over at the edge of the neighborhood not to look back, but to open my phone and update my net worth statement, watching the numbers settle into their new configuration, with the SUV sitting in the primary asset column, fully titled in my name, a calculated purchase offering mobility without the ghost of debt. And as the sunset hit the dashboard in a long golden smear, and I pulled onto the overlook, I realized that true revenge isn't about the noise you make when you leave, but about the silence you can afford once you're gone. Because by cutting out the predatory interest and the dealer's bloated fees, I had saved $24,000 in pure capital already being rerouted into a diversified index fund, a seed for a future they hadn't even begun to imagine. And I had watched the clock for years, waiting for permission to be powerful, before realizing that power isn't granted, it's calculated, and I have no more debts to settle and no more apologies to make. Because the horizon looks different when you aren't squinting through the dust of someone else's lead, and the dealership will send their follow-up emails and the onlookers will keep speculating on how I did it, but their opinions are just background noise now, and this was never simply about the status symbol or the leather smell. It was about the leverage of a quiet exit, because I didn't just buy a car, I bought back my time. And before you shift into your own next gear, I want to know, what is the one financial boundary you have set for yourself this year that changed everything? Drop it in the comments, because the road ahead is wide and clear, and it is entirely yours.